Great, thank you, and thank you for including us in this conference, and thank you also to the Sloan Foundation for funding this research. This is co-authored work with Bob Clark, who's in the audience, and I guess I should say also thank you for sticking around for the last after-lunch session. I'm going to be talking about retirement timing, now thinking specifically about public sector workers and how they might be different from the total population that we've been thinking about for the rest of the conference. And in particular, the major reason why they're different is that they're still covered, for the most part, by defined benefit pension plans. And the way that defined benefit pension plans work, as we know, have very strong incentives for earlier retirement. So what I'm going to talk about today, many factors, of course, influence desired retirement timing, but the financial incentives for retirement are going to be a potential obstacle to working longer. We know that DB pensions yield spikes in lifetime pension wealth, and so we predict that workers are going to time retirement at pension eligibility, and they're going to retire at pretty young ages. And I'll show some evidence of this. The questions that we address in this paper are not new. We want to look at whether or not workers are timing their eligibility once they're eligible for full benefits and whether or not they're taking advantage of early retirement benefit options. We do find some evidence that there's still excess retirements at age 62 once we control for pension plan eligibility. And what I've highlighted here is kind of where we see our big contribution. What we're trying to do that's new in this paper is really use some data that we've collected, some interesting survey data, to understand a little bit of the heterogeneity and what characteristics are associated with higher responsiveness to financial incentives. So I won't spend too long, obviously, on the prior literature. It's written by a lot of people in this room, but just the study really heavily draws from the fact that we know that the key eligibility ages in defined benefit plans really matter, and that forward-looking measures of pension wealth do a pretty good job of explaining retirement timing. And there's kind of a new literature that's come out that suggests that workers may not be responding to financial incentives in the intensive margin, but more to this idea of salience, or they just sort of know that normal retirement is a good time to retire. So what we're looking at in our study is North Carolina public sector workers. And we find, consistent with the prior literature, that workers do respond to financial incentives. What we were hoping to show you today was an analysis of really great and interesting heterogeneous impacts, but what we found, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, was very little heterogeneity, at least within the preliminary data that we're looking at. So I'll show you some of that. Before I show you the results, I want to take some time to talk about the data itself and this larger project that this paper fits into. It's a 6-year project. We're collecting a lot of data. We have 5 different surveys that we've run, plus we're matching that to administrative records. So we have 2 cohorts that we're following. And the cohort that we'll use for this paper are workers who are actively employed in 2014 who are over age 50, so workers that are just about to retire. And we fielded a survey in 2014 before any of them had started the retirement process, so we can kind of have this baseline characteristics. And then we follow these individuals. We conducted a survey in 2016 and a survey in we're planning a survey in 2018 that will hopefully be in the field in March. And the types of questions that we're interested in are things like planning for retirement and retirement timing and health and caregiving. So we have a lot of detailed information about that. Also a part of this larger project, but not in the results I'm going to show today, is a cohort of individuals that claimed retirement benefits between 2009 and 2014. And we followed them over time as well. And looked at their annuity choice and their post-retirement employment and retirement income security and well-being. I'll cite some results from that all the way at the end. Okay, so the current data that I'm going to be talking about is collected in March 2014. We have administrative records on all workers that were age 50 to 64. And what I'm going to do for this paper is to restrict to those who were hired between age 22 and 39 who had no breaks in service and no withdrawn service. So I'm narrowing down the sample because that gives me a very good measure of who's going to be eligible for early or normal retirement benefits. We can model that very clearly. And then this is going to be merged with survey responses from about 700 people, and the survey was conducted prior to the retirement decision. I'm going to merge this with retirements that happened by April 2016. So we have a 2-year period which we observe some people transitioning to retirement, and we're going to try and understand who's transitioning to retirement and who's not. Hopefully, future versions of this paper will be able to incorporate an additional 1.5 years of retirements and additional survey responses to give us a little bit more power to hopefully tease out some of the heterogeneity that I think is at least suggestive in what we found so far. The purpose of this paper is to understand whether or not workers are responding to financial incentives for retirement. We argue that the present value calculations are pretty complicated, and so the theory predicts that people should be responsive to the financial incentives. And so when we originally started this project, we were hoping to kind of tease out whether or not people were responding to the financial incentive itself or to some salient age, like they know they just have to get 30 years of service. What it turns out, after we did a lot of simulations involving these present values of pension benefits, is that for most of our sample, the peak value of their retirement wealth is exactly when they're eligible for normal retirement. So it's going to appear in the data like rule of thumb decision making, just timing your retirement for when you're eligible for normal benefits is the optimal or the present value wealth maximizing choice. So all workers in our sample are covered by Social Security, and they have kind of a typical DB plan structure. It's pretty generous. It's about a 60% replacement rate on average. And one thing that's sort of maybe not unusual, but important to know about North Carolina retirement is that a worker can retire with 30 years of service at any age. And so we have a lot of our sample is going to be hitting normal retirement eligibility in their 50s, maybe even their early 50s. So we're gonna observe a lot of pretty early retirements. And then if you hit age 60 with at least 25 years of service, you're eligible for full retirement. The early retirement factor is not linear, and it's not necessarily actuarially fair. So we also tried to identify to use some of that nonlinearity. I don't know if you can see this okay, but basically it's about a 5% reduction per year, but there's lots of places where that's not true. And so it may be complicated for workers to figure out exactly what the wealth maximizing timing of early retirement could be with this somewhat complicated schedule. And what we observe, I just have a few graphs of who actually retires. So for our cohort, that should say 22 to 39 on the left, 22 to 29, sorry about that. So people who are hired in their 20s, almost all of them are going to wait until they're eligible for full retirement right at 30 years of service. So we see a few people retiring early, but most of them are going to go ahead and wait until they're eligible for normal retirement because that's going to happen sometime in their 50s. Whereas those people who were hired when they were in their 30s, on the right-hand side, many of them are going to hit early retirement at age 20, at 20 years of service, and then normal retirement right at 30. And what this means for age of retirement, on the left-hand side, you can see that the age of retirement for those who are hired in their 20s is spread pretty uniformly over their 50s. They're just sort of hitting normal retirement all along there. Whereas those that were hired in their 30s, we see this peak down at age 60 and then at age 65, and otherwise it's pretty smooth. The other thing that I want to point out is this age 62 effect we see in both cohorts. Those that were hired in their 20s have this excess retirement that seems to happen at age 62. So the people who are not taking their normal retirement as soon as they're eligible seem to be waiting until age 62 when they'd be eligible for Social Security. So we see the same pattern emerging when we look at the distribution of people who have already retired. We see that those that were hired in their 20s are all basically retiring in their 50s, except for this small bump up at age 62. And those that were hired in their 30s are mostly retiring at age 60, when they're first eligible for early retirement, or some of them for normal retirement, and then also this slight bump up at age 62. So the graphical evidence certainly suggests that the financial incentives really matter for when people are timing their retirement. People do seem to be responding to these key ages when they're making their retirement choices. And we see this clustering here for the age of hire. Almost all of them are retiring under 30 years of service. And here we have 20 and 25 are the key years. So in order to get an approximation of what the present value of retirement wealth is, we construct these hypothetical workers. One of them started working at age 24. They're going to reach their peak present value retirement wealth at 30 years of service. And if we compare them with someone who has the exact same profile, the same earnings growth, but was hired 10 years later, we observe that they're getting a lot less out of their pension. And so perhaps the incentive to wait until they're eligible for normal retirement could be less. And this is sort of what the graphs look like. For someone hired at age 24, their peak at their normal retirement age, and for someone at age 34, they are also peaking at their normal retirement age, but the slope up is much flatter. And so when we estimate these models empirically, we're going to see patterns that are consistent with this, that the incentives for waiting until normal retirement are larger for those that are hired in their 20s than for those hired in their 30s, and the younger cohorts are going to be more responsive. Okay, so the graphical evidence certainly suggests that incentives matter. We estimate hazard models of those who are eligible for retirement to see if they do in fact retire. The results are very similar if I model the incentive to retire as the percent benefit reduction, using a peak value difference measure, or just looking at normal retirement eligibility. So I'm only going to show the normal retirement eligibility today. And here's sort of what it looks like. Those who are eligible, these are marginal effects from a probit model. So those who are eligible for, those that were hired in their 20s are about 16.9 percentage points more likely to retire once they're eligible for normal benefits, and that's compared with only 10 percentage points for those that were hired in their 30s. And what we can see is that for those that were hired in their 20s, this age 62 also increases the retirement hazard. They're about 7.5 percentage points more likely to retire. These are pretty big effects off of a mean of only 15% of the sample is retiring at any given period. And this age 62 effect is seen for the older age or higher group also, but it is, these individuals are more likely to retire in their 60s at any age in their 60s. We look for heterogeneity within our administrative records, so our larger sample, and we do find some evidence of heterogeneity, but it's not as strong as we might have thought. We compare some of our sample as eligible for retiree health insurance and some is not, and we do see some excess retirements at age 65 that could be plausibly due to that. And we see some differences by salary, but we don't find these similar patterns in the older age or higher group. So we next bring in our survey data, and just descriptively, we can see here, we're just looking at the fraction of people who retire under early or retire under normal benefits, and we see that more people are going to be retiring under normal benefits than early benefits, and that we see some suggestive evidence that there may be differences by education level. So by having a college degree, you're more likely to wait until you're eligible for normal retirement, and perhaps some differences by health status, although those don't turn out to be statistically significant in the data. What we thought that we might find is differences by financial literacy or plans to work after retirement. That's these two rows here, and we don't actually find very strong differences along those dimensions, at least in this smaller sample. So this is what it looks like in a regression context. We have eligible for normal retirement, and then when we interact with a college degree, we see that being eligible for normal retirement is much more important for those with a college degree. but no differences by race or marital status. And then when we look at differences by own or spouse's health, we see the sign that we might have expected, but it is not statistically significantly different. So, so far, we haven't found much evidence of heterogeneity as we had hoped. Certainly the last bullet point we're hoping will help when we incorporate additional data, we'll have some more power. But there's also a lot of other aspects that may be going on with the decision to retire that we have not yet incorporated that we're hoping to. Outside earnings potential is certainly one of them. We think that workers maybe need to or are going to find outside employment. It turns out when we look at our sample of workers who have already retired, only about 30% of them are working. So it doesn't seem like that is a pattern that actually occurs. But we have some information also on job characteristics, spousal retirement status, supplemental retirement savings. We're interested in looking at Social Security claiming and retiree health insurance. So the overall project, we're trying to understand how public workers manage these relatively young retirement ages, whether or not they can find work outside of retirement, outside of their pension system when they're collecting benefits, and can these public workers sustain their standard of living through what is likely going to be a very long retirement if they're separating from their employer in their 50s. And we want to understand what characteristics of public workers are going to determine their retirement timing. And our prior work, which Bob presented here a couple years ago, suggests that only about 30% of these workers are ultimately working in retirement. And so we may be concerned that the financial incentives that are inherent in these defined benefit pension plans are pushing people out at very young ages, and they're not going on to take other jobs. So just in conclusion, we certainly find evidence, I think, that financial incentives for retirement, they depend on age at hire. They're going to coincide with salient ages. Workers are more likely to retire under full benefits, under normal benefits, than early benefits. We find evidence of excess retirements at key Social Security ages. We do not find strong evidence of heterogeneity and responsiveness. And we conclude from this work that financial incentives for retirement may inhibit workers' desired or ability to work longer at their public employer. Thank you.
I want to thank John first for the opportunity to be part of the conference, which I've really enjoyed, and also for the opportunity to take a deep dive into this paper. I'm someone who has been interested in how the financial incentives, especially from Social Security, affect retirement decisions. So I appreciated the opportunity to think about the pension piece of the puzzle a little bit more than I usually get to. And there's some features of this paper that are very nice, as I wanted to highlight. So obviously, this is part of a large and well-established at this point literature on how financial incentives from Social Security and pensions affect retirement, and a subset of that literature has focused on public sector employees and in some cases teachers in particular, and we have people in the audience who've contributed to that piece of the literature. Again, coming from my background studying Social Security, one of the things that's kind of nice when you go over into the world where pensions are more important is that there are these spikes in the accrual of retirement wealth that tend to be sharper than what we see for Social Security, which is helpful for the identification. And as you'll see from my comments, I really got kind of into this particular aspect of trying to understand what these incentives look like and sort of think about how they compare to incentives from Social Security. So what's new, given that there is an existing literature? Well, first, one very interesting aspect of this plan, the way it's set up, is that it's both age as well as years of service that affect your eligibility for full benefits. And as a result, there are really different incentives for people hired in their 20s versus in their 30s. By the time people get into their 50s and 60s, incentives look very different depending on age of hire. So that's something the authors are going to exploit. The other aspect, which is really nice and which is only beginning to be exploited, but will be exploited more as this work continues, is the fact that they have both the kind of detailed administrative records which you actually need to calculate these incentives properly. You need to know people's earnings history, but also this, more unusually, that this is combined with this survey data that they're collecting, which will allow them to look at heterogeneity along a number of dimensions, as was discussed. The survey data as of yet is of a fairly small sample size, so as this data continues to be collected over time, they will hopefully, there'll be more that they're able to do with it. And the key findings were just presented really clearly, so I don't have to kind of bore you with going over it again, but the basic idea that these incentives really do look different by age of hire, and that we see that lining up both in sort of descriptive graphical evidence with people retiring at given ages or year of service benchmarks, as we would expect based on their eligibility for benefits, and that incentives matter story is confirmed in the regression analysis. So we just saw this picture, but this is, I got very interested when I saw this picture, as you'll see, and kind of spent a lot of time decomposing it. So let me try to explain. So this is a hypothetical worker who started at the same salary, $35,000, and has experienced 2% earnings growth throughout, let's just say, her career. But the difference is whether the worker was hired at age 24 versus age 34. And obviously there's similarities in these profiles. They both have the rough characteristic that wealth accrues until a certain age, and then beyond a certain age, the PDV of retirement wealth is declining with additional work. But there's differences. The level is lower for the person hired at 34. That's not that surprising. That's mostly explained by discounting, because everything's discounted back to age 50. So if you're starting those benefits at a later age, that's going to make a big difference. But there's other differences in the profiles beyond just that can be explained by the discounting, and that made me interested in wanting to make sure that I understood why these profiles had the shape that they had. So that's where my brain went, as you will see. So, whether it's Social Security or pensions, we can always approach the question of how does an extra year of work affect the PDV of retirement benefits. And there's sort of two simple, relatively simple. It starts off simple and it gets more complicated, basically, is the message. So if I'm already accrued enough eligibility that I can be receiving benefits, then the choice I face by working another year is giving up a certain year of benefits today, and we're calling that B max. The max just refers to the fact that if I take this as a single life annuity, I'll get a higher pension benefit compared to joint life annuity. So I give up B max by choosing to work one more year. But on the other hand, there's going to be some delta B max. There's going to be some increase in this pension annuity that I will earn by working another year. So it's a trade-off between these two things. And actually, delta B max itself is a little bit complicated when you think about it. So this is, as Melinda said, a pretty kind of standard sort of DB pension formula. A simplified formula might be 2% times years of service times final earnings, and that's basically what this is. 1.82% times years of service times an average of your highest 4 years of earnings, and then this actual reduction factor, which is where it gets a little more complicated with the years of service and the age. So people being eligible for full benefits at 30 years of service or 25 years of service as long as they've hit 60. If they don't want to wait quite that long, they're eligible starting at 20 years of service, but there's some pretty significant actuarial reduction on the order of 5% for each year before full eligibility. So when you think about how does an extra year of work play into this delta B max, well, I get one more year of service, so that's good. Because we're assuming earnings are continuing to increase, I get to replace in that average of 4 top years, I get 1 year that's a little bit higher than the one that's replaced. That's also good. And if I'm between that sort of 20 and 30 years of service, I get a benefit on the actual reduction piece. Now that's all just about the benefit annuity, so then you have to put it into PDV terms. So we need to know the size of B max and delta B max. We also need to think about the discount rate, obviously, since delta B max is about the whole stream of future benefits, and what that's going to look like on a PDV basis obviously depends on the discount rate. And then we have the survival probability piece. If Bmax and delta Bmax are just calibrated such that the PDV is unchanged with an additional year of work, then if you fast forward me ahead a few years and my mortality risk is a little bit higher, that's not going to be an even trade anymore, right? So the survival probabilities matter as well. So this is just, I did some of my own little simulations. Again, this is just where my brain went to kind of understand these incentives. So this is what Bmax looks like by age of retirement for this person who started at 24. So it jumps up when they get to 44, they get their 20 years of service. Now they could get a $9,000 a year benefit, and it continues to increase for future years of work. And it's hard actually from this picture to tell what's going on. So if you look at the delta Bmax instead, how this is changing with each additional year of work, So from this previous picture, it looks like maybe there's a little hiccup at 54, but it's hard to tell what's happening with the slope that well. So the big, obviously, spike, that's getting to the 20 years of eligibility. But I think the rest of this shape is kind of interesting, too. So this is always positive, obviously. I'm always adding to my benefit eligibility in terms of an annual benefit. PDV is different, but in terms of the annual benefit, I'm always adding by additional work at a rate that's increasing until I get to age 54, and then there's not really a spike or anything at 54, but the delta B max, the amount by which my annual benefit goes up with additional work, sort of takes a hit, and then it continues to increase. So I calculated this for myself, but it wasn't immediately obvious, to me anyways, why it would have this zigzag shape. So that made me want to decompose it, hopefully you're still with me, into the different pieces. So the gray refers to the year of service. So that's just the increment to my benefit that's just coming from the benefit of, say, multiplying times 22 years of service instead of times 21. And in dollar terms, that continues to increase over time because the longer I hang with this job, my earnings are going up, my pension eligibility is going up, all these things are going up, and so the value of one more year of service in dollars terms continues to rise throughout the possible years I could be working. Same thing with average earnings. My earnings are going up by 2% a year, so that's always valuable, and because everything's multiplied together, right, the value of getting 2% higher earnings just gets bigger and bigger in dollar terms as everything else gets bigger. The blue is obviously the big story. That's where the actuarial adjustment piece is. So the fact that the person's getting only roughly half their full benefit if they claim with 20 years of service, but they can get it, all the way up to 100%. That's where all the big action is. And then the green is the interaction. Hopefully the way I did this made sense, but basically I thought about changing each factor, holding all the other ones constant. But of course, if you work one more year, all those things change at the same time, so you get a little added boost from the fact that all those things are changing simultaneously. So that gives you some sense, hopefully, of where that kind of zigzag pattern in the previous thing came from. Now, the comparison of the 24 to the 34 person, well, if I cut the figure off at age 59, these would be exactly the same, just shifted 10 years over, because after all, this person just started 10 years later, so everything looks very similar. But you have some sense that at age 60, something suddenly is a little different in the two. And you can see that better with the delta B max. So the gray is just what we already looked at, the spike and then the zigzag. And again, you get the same spike. But the rest of the pattern looks a little different, and the reason is because by getting to age 60, even though I haven't made it to 30 years of service yet, I get to kind of skip what I would have normally had to work 4 more years to get all the way up to 100% of benefit. I get to skip right there in 1 year. So that generates a spike that wasn't there for the other person because they didn't get to skip. They had to work all the way up to the 30 years. So that's it broken down by the different components. Again, it's the actuarial adjustment piece is the big story. Okay, so why did I take us through this? Because as I said, I was trying to understand why this figure had the shape that it did. And for me anyways, sort of breaking it down into pieces and then putting it back together was helpful. I think I can understand, or it's not that difficult. I think we can understand for the 24-year-old person where things go up and then go down, that's where there's that zigzag where suddenly Bmax, you're always adding to your annual benefit, but suddenly not by as much once you've maxed out the benefit of delaying from the actuarial adjustment piece. And so then when you're trading off, I have to give up 1 year of certain benefits, but then my benefit will be higher in the future, suddenly it's not worth it. So that pattern makes sense to me. And I think we understand why there's spikes in the age 34. I have to say there's some things about this picture that still don't make sense to me, and it might just be that there's something very simple that I haven't, kind of figured out. But like why the slopes are not the same on the other side of the peak isn't totally clear to me. And for that matter, in this picture, it would look like in the 50s, the benefit of additional work should be similar across the two groups, and yet in one case the PDV is up, and one case the PDV is going down. So really, this is just a plea for a little bit more transparency in the paper. at least if you're a reader like me, you see this picture and you kind of want to really understand what the features are of the pension plan that are leading incentives to look the way that they look. No doubt these eligibility ages are really important, but I think kind of having some sense of what it is about the pension formula that generates a path that looks like this is useful. And in particular, I'd also like to see more sensitivity to the discount rate, which is obviously a super easy thing to recompute these incentives with a different discount rate. Right now they're using 7.5% because that's what the plan is required to use in making its own calculations, but obviously what's relevant is what we think the worker might use in approaching the decision, and that might not be 7.5%. And there might actually be heterogeneity, which is one of the things that I know you're planning to and hope that you'll get a chance to play around with through the survey. So just one last thing is I wanted to sort of compare what we know about Social Security incentives. As I said, one of the things that's interesting about pensions is that you do get these spikes in incentives, and it's very clear that people should stay in the workforce until particular ages because their pension wealth, well, let me back up and say it this way, that with pensions, you can't just think 1 year ahead. You have to think about the whole stream of incentives because oftentimes there's some spike out there in the future. Or even if there's not a spike, there's the chance to earn positive accrual year after year after year, and if you just think on a 1 year basis, you miss it. So this is really taking us back, a classic paper, hopefully, a classic on my CV anyways, of some work that I did with yeah, I don't want to call my work a classic, but an old paper that I did with John Gruber, where we were basically making the point that even though this was better understood that in the case of pensions you had to think about forward-looking incentives and spikes and so on in the future, that there could be some of this in Social Security. So if you've been staring at this picture trying to understand what the heck it's about, now I can explain. Basically, we took people from the HRS, so this is the sort of early years of the HRS. This is really looking at the heterogeneity across workers, whereas before we were looking at kind of the path for one sample worker. But it was saying that for at least some workers, the evolution of their Social Security wealth with additional work follows a path where we need to think about the forward-looking incentives because that wealth is continuing. It's not enough to just look at the 1 year change. As I said a minute ago, you might be missing the fact that wealth is continuing to accrue over some period of time. So it actually turns out, let's start with this path because this is more like the pension one we were looking at where it just goes up and then down. These are PDVs now, right? So there's some people where their pension wealth continues to accrue up until about age 65, and then after age 65 it turns negative. And this would be for many people before all those increases in the delayed retirement credit went into effect. So the reason that your wealth doesn't increase anymore with additional work after 65 is the actuarial adjustment for delayed claiming is simply not generous enough to compensate for the loss of a certain year of benefits. Then you have people like the one above where in their late 50s work is not rewarded through Social Security because if you think about what's going on at that age, I work 1 more year, that goes into my AMI calculation, but I also have to pay payroll taxes, and the net of those two things could be negative. But then once I get to 62, there's a new thing, which is I can delay claiming for a year, and that gets me a higher benefit. And once you add that in, it turns the accrual positive again, but only until 65. So it's negative, and then it goes negative again. So that's the people above. And you put those two people together, and that's more than 40% of people where, again, we were arguing it's important to kind of think of this forward-looking path. On the other hand, you've got other people like that where the accrual is just negative all the way down. And obviously the exact numbers of people that are going to have these different kinds of path is going to be highly sensitive to what you assume about discount rates and so on. But just the idea that forward-looking incentives can matter for Social Security too. When I put this up, I thought, wow, this is really old. It would be nice if we kind of knew what this looked like now because there have been some changes in Social Security. Like as I mentioned, the delayed retirement credit has increased, and that might change what the incentive to look like, to work after 65 would look like. And then I remembered, oh wait, I'm doing some of that work. So I will quickly show you some of this work. No, really, that was my thought process. I didn't immediately realize I was doing some of this work. So I'll just hopefully take you through this quickly in the vein of, that this is a crowd that would hopefully find this interesting, how the incentives for additional work through Social Security have been changing over the years, even though I'm now moving slightly away from the paper. So I'll just try to be relatively quick about it. So this would be now we're back to the idea of a sample worker, a male who's earned median wages, and he reaches age 55 in 1980, and what does his path of the accrual of Social Security wealth look like over the rest of his working life. So for this guy, and I haven't put taxes in yet, this is just the benefit piece. He's got very little accrual of wealth between 55 and 62, because basically he is putting a new year into his AMI formula, but if he's earned sort of median wages over his lifetime, it turns out that's replacing a year that was almost as good as the new one that went in, and so there's basically very little benefit. On the other hand, oh, that's right. So our median worker is, so we did this for different types of worker, and I'm only showing you the median. So the median guy started his career at age 20. We have low-income workers who started at 16 and high-income workers who started at 25, just based on having different, different numbers of years of education. But this guy started at 20. So he's got his 35 years in. We're using these sort of average wage profiles. So if you want a different wage profile, the number you could get where there's a little bit of an incentive, but not much of an incentive. But then you get to 62, now you've got the delayed claiming, and the adjustment, again, this is going to depend a little bit on the discount rate, but here it's working out to be more than actuarially fair. So you can increase your Social Security wealth by delaying, but then once you get to age 65, the adjustment's less than fair, and this is under the old delayed retirement credit of only 3% a year. It was not enough to reward people for giving up that year of certain benefits. All right, very quickly, I'm just going to flip this. Instead of an accrual, I'm going to report this as a tax rate. So I'm going to take this amount and scale it by earnings, and also flip it upside down, where now a positive number means there's a tax. So staying at, continuing to work is being taxed by the Social Security system. So if you're with me with the flipping it upside down, and I added Social Security taxes in as well, so now the system is taxing work at a kind of constant rate, and then there might be a little bit of incentive to work, and then it's taxing it at a much higher rate. So remember, this whole point was I wanted to show you how this changed over time, which we can now do. So this is, I'm just going to go year by year, have a line for every year. We're taking the exact same guy, we're keeping his earnings the same, we're keeping his mortality the same, because we just want to see how changes to Social Security are affecting incentives, holding everything else constant. So some of the lines lie on top of each other because there isn't a change to the rules every year. But this is where the delayed retirement credit starts to be phased in, from 3 to 3.5 to 4. They changed it every 2 years, and every time they changed it, work at these oldest ages is penalized a little less compared to what it was before. Now we move into the 90s. If you can imagine where those lines were before, they keep coming down, because we actually did this in like 10 different, like a lot of different steps, right? So the return to work at older ages, it keeps getting higher, or the tax keeps getting lower. This looks like a big mess of spaghetti in here. This is from the changes to the normal retirement age. And if it seems off with the years, you have to remember the year is keyed off of the year a guy was 55. So if he's 55 in 1995, then it's 2002 by the time he's 62, so this is when the normal retirement age is starting to increase, and that's changing a little bit the eligibility, and then there's much less going on in the 2000s and the 2010s, and so just to take some representative years, the overall story, the 1980 line is the highest one, and these lower lines are the recent years, and you can basically see that the way that the Social Security system has changed has greatly incentivized, or I don't know if I'd say greatly, but has moved in the direction of creating stronger incentives, or at least fewer disincentives to work at older ages. Okay, so I've gone way away from the paper. let me bring it back. I did want to draw this contrast, because even with a picture like this, I think that the incentives are still sharper in DB plans, but it's kind of interesting to contrast them, hopefully, to the magnitude of the incentives in Social Security. So what I really like about this paper was that I hadn't really thought about the fact that in a plan like this plan, both age at higher as well as, both years of service and your age are going into eligibility, and it creates these interesting differences and incentives across age at higher that are very, very useful for understanding how people are responding to incentives. And in fact, the early results seem very convincing that people do respond to incentives. One thing I'm wondering, I really liked just the descriptive pictures where you see these spikes in retirement at the ages that you would expect, and I'm wondering if they have enough data to look at sort of individual age of hire, because that's very powerful evidence where you can see the spike moving from 54 to 55 to 56 to 57. What would be the reason except that these people are hitting their 30 years of eligibility at these specific ages? So that would be very nice. If we can do that, I know they have plans to continue this work building in an option value model, and from survey data that there's more things that they're going to be able to do. And so these are just a few of the things that I'm interested in. I'm curious whether, especially some of these very early retirees, what are they doing? Are they they're just not working as a teacher, but maybe they're working. I'm curious if they're working. The interactions with Social Security and Medicare seem really interesting. The fact that there's these excess retirements at 62 and 65 suggests that Social Security is having an impact on these people, even though they have a very generous DB. And so understanding their other access to health insurance, I think, would be interesting. And the heterogeneity analysis, I think, is very interesting, and I'm especially interested in the time preference part of it. So that is it. Thanks.
Do you see, I had one question. Do you see cases where somebody reaches 30 years, the employer, the state, I guess, wants the person to continue, and you see that wages go up to offset the fact that the PDV of the pension is going down, but you're trying to figure out how to incent them to continue to work, or does that not happen?
So I think a lot of our workers they're on a salary schedule, so the employer doesn't, so we haven't, it would be an easy thing to check. Some agencies are covered by salary schedules and some are not. So you actually could see a difference. So we haven't noticed, people worry a lot about pension spiking, which would have the same appearance, that in the couple of years before you claim your pension, you start to take on extra responsibilities, and so you have additional earnings. So I'm not sure how you would distinguish.
No, I was just thinking 54 is a pretty young age to be basically shoving somebody.
Yeah.
You're not exactly shoving them, but you've lowered the return to working, put it that way, and given them some incentive to retire. And
So John, I think in general, one second. You can't pick it up. Sorry. Thank you. In general, one could think about this as these pensions were all, and this is very similar to other state pensions around.
Yeah.
I mean, North Carolina's sort of right in the middle of generosity and all the other characteristics, and so going back 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago when these pensions were put into place, maybe people thought that 50 or so. The problem has been that no state plans have been able to really get at the grips and say, why would we want people to leave in their 50s today? And another, if you're thinking about it from the employer standpoint, the point that Melinda had on the board there was that if you're hired at 24 and you leave at 54, your pension is $330,000 or something along that. As opposed, if you're hired at 34, it's $100 and some odd thousand present value using simulation. So I tried to tell the state of North Carolina that at one time. If you're thinking about this pension plan, you're paying literally twice as much on the pension plan for the person you hired at 34, but it's 24. Does that make any sense? So if you're thinking about redesigning pension plans, looking at these graphs would tell you something about why is it that you would want to continue these plans as they are now. But certainly from the employee standpoint, as both Melinda and Courtney show, I mean, there's certainly strong signals to leave at particular times, and you actually, if you went out the numbers under certain circumstances, your actual present value goes down for continued work, and that's certainly a disincentive to work too. So it's not just access early; it's the fact that the value of working that extra year is going down as well.
so Courtney showed that Social Security rules, and particularly for 65 and over, changed dramatically many times. But I take it your North Carolina system has been pretty much in place for a long time?
That's correct. I don't know exactly when these went into place, but they've been there a long time, and that would be true for other state plans too. So what you've noticed in the last 10, 15 years is that states are changing their defined benefit plans on lots of different dimensions, but they're all for new workers. And so the current crop of retirees in the next 10 years are going to be under these same basic format.
So I'm wondering how much variety is there in type of job and job characteristics? I mean, does this data set include college professors and state cops and laborers and so on? Because certain of those jobs, after 30 years of doing it, you want out because your back hurts. And in other jobs like Bob's, your back will never hurt. So,
Um, it's all state and local government workers, except police and fire are not included, and university faculty that opted to be in the university faculty program are not included. So we do have some university professors in the data set, but it's a.
but is there still a pretty broad breadth of type of job?
We're just now digging into how much detail we can figure out about that, but theoretically, our local government workers can be drawn. We certainly have a lot of people that started work at age 18 and are retiring at age 48, and so they're clearly not highly skilled jobs. Yeah.
Every state worker and every local government worker, with the exception of college professors who opt into a TIA type plan, are in our data set. So about half the data are public school teachers, and that would be true in almost every state if you look at the number of public employees. But then it's people that work in DOJ and DMV and so on down the line. So it's literally everybody is in this state. So it's diverse. It's all public workers.
And what do you know about them? What do you know which one of them they are?
Yes.
Yeah.
We know the agency to which they work.
But again, even in the same agency, there could be janitors and, I'm just saying, I think a lot of why people would retire at age 30 is that it's a tough job, it's a hard job, it's a tiring job, it's an uninteresting job, as opposed to other jobs that are fun.
So the results, I sort of rushed through this part, but low salary workers are definitely are retiring earlier, which is consistent with that, yeah. I mean, these are not the best jobs, right, that are below median earnings.
We got one more back here.
Okay.
Well, I was just thinking that if in your survey you have information or can get information on how long they worked in other jobs for which they don't get creditable service, because that's kind of like a placebo in some sense. Because you could think about someone working for a certain total number of years and then they just give out. And so that's kind of the alternative explanation for tending to cluster at certain number of years of service. But you can kind of test that if you can get their total amount that they've actually worked and show that years of service, that count toward the pension, you see the spike in that, but you don't see anything relating to how long they had worked in other jobs.
Yeah, we didn't ask them that, and I'm not sure that I would believe what they answered if we had, because it's a very hard question to answer. These are workers in their 50s and 60s, so if you ask them about what you were doing back in your 20s, but I take the suggestion as very interesting.
Okay, I think we'll bring this to a close. I think we should thank Celia and Ben again. And Celia, make Celia's life easy. Answer the Survey Monkey. Kathleen would like you to do that too. That is, in the past I haven't done as good a job as I should at having these evaluations, and they will have impact on how we do this next year. We're funded for 2 more years, so I hope to see you all back next fall. Not necessarily the same corresponding date. In fact, if you want to put on the Survey Monkey particular dates that don't work, I can't please everybody, but if I found a lot of people who said don't do it the first Thursday, Friday of November, we won't do it the first Thursday, Friday of November. I kind of like Thursday, Friday, and I kind of like this 1 p.m. start on Thursday and this early afternoon finish. If we have 10 papers, I know I said 9 earlier, but we had 10. And 9 or 10 papers is kind of what I think. But send me some feedback if you think it'd be better if we had fewer papers in more depth, or whether you like this 50 minutes per paper. But particularly, if there's researchers or papers I've actually got several ideas, but doesn't hurt to have more. And particularly, there may be people doing great work that wouldn't occur to me. So thank you.